afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. It's time to mark your card. The campaigning's over and Britain is going to the polls to choose the next government. Polling stations will stay open until 10 o'clock tonight, and so far the weather's been good. All the main party leaders have already voted, and our political correspondent Sean Lay has been keeping an eye on the morning's events. Sean.
Well, Anna, the noise and excitement of the last few weeks of campaigning has finally subsided to be replaced by the rather more gentle sounds of pencils scratching crosses onto ballot papers. The party leaders themselves have been doing just that this morning, ensuring they can count on at least one vote each, their own. It's not just his family who've changed in 4 years, but for the Prime Minister, as for any other politician, Election Day is the great leveller. Tony Blair walked with his wife and children to their local polling station in Trimdon, County Durham. In the neighbouring constituency, Richmond in Yorkshire, the Haigs voted side by side. The Conservative leader was casting his ballot in the village of Catterick.
Right, gone.
Charles Kennedy visited a polling station in his Highlands constituency.
You're not talking fashion.
Although Mr Kennedy has joined a growing trend at this election, he's already voted by post, though that wouldn't have made such a good picture. In South Wales, election officials have come up with some imaginative ways to make voting more convenient. You can do it while getting in the weekly shop or pop into the front room of this former miner's cottage. One man without such a personal stake as the other party leaders in the outcome is the President of Plaid Cymru, Ieuan Wyn-Jones. Plaid's first MP was elected in 1966, and this is the first time the leader isn't standing in the general election. The SNP leader, John Swinney, is also not a candidate this time. He voted this morning in his former constituency, Tayside North. For those voters who are still not sure whether to turn out, there's a sharp word from 98-year-old Doris Cann from Birchington in Kent. She's been going to the polls at every election for more than 70 years.
How will the country run if nobody votes for somebody? They've got to run a country, haven't they? And they've got to have votes. And if people don't go, what's happening?
And there's no excuse either if you live on an island. Ballot boxes were this morning being delivered to Rathlin off the coast of County Antrim. Although the earliest results in the general election are expected before midnight, in Northern Ireland the outcome won't be known until tomorrow afternoon. And Charles Kennedy's not the only one taking advantage of the new, more relaxed rules for postal voting. In some areas, as many as 1 in 3 voters will be taking part by post. So some ballot stations like this one in Vauxhall in South London could be a good deal quieter than usual, Anna.
Thank you very much. A survivor has given the first eyewitness account of the massacre of the Nepalese royal family, and he's confirmed it was Crown Prince Dipendra who carried out the killings. Another member of the royal family has described how the drunken prince went from room to room in the palace, shooting at members of the royal family.
He wants the truth to come out. Maheshwar Kumar Singh, uncle to the late King Birendra, and an eyewitness to the carnage at the palace. For 6 days he's been silent and in shock, and now he's talking exclusively to the BBC about the killing of almost the entire Nepali royal family.
Well, 100%, really I'm very sorry to say that it has been done by him, but the fact is fact. I've seen it, and I have to very painfully, take his name, that it was no other person than Crown Prince Dipendra Veer Bikram Shahdeo.
Some grieving Nepalis may have heard this before, as rumors or unsourced reports. But Mr. Kumar Singh told us explicitly he was standing with the late king, having a pre-dinner drink, when the Crown Prince came in military fatigues with a submachine gun.
I remember he fired first shot. It was towards the ceiling, I think. And then thereafter, immediately it went brrr. Then I looked round, and when I saw His Majesty, I found that he was lurching on one side, going back, and gradually sinking. Then I realized something had happened.
Mr. Kumar Singh saw 3 other people get shot before diving for cover behind a sofa. He was wounded himself. He heard the other dreadful killings in the palace that have so saddened and angered the people of Nepal. They search their media every day, hoping to hear what happened, but only now are survivors coming forward. Nearly a week after this horrific massacre, the survivors and those that were there that evening are starting to speak out in their homes and elsewhere around the capital. What remains to be seen now is whether the truth, as seen by those people, will quell things in the streets where rumors abound and people are discontented and angry. Daniel Lack, BBC News, Kathmandu.
A lifelong smoker who's dying of cancer has been awarded £2 billion in compensation by a jury in the United States. It ordered the money to be paid by the cigarette maker Philip Morris. The company says it will fight the decision.
Found guilty on 6 counts of fraud, negligence and making a defective product, the jury in Los Angeles ordered the tobacco manufacturer's Philip Morris pay $3.5 billion in damages to a 56-year-old Californian man dying of cancer.
I think in the jury room a lot of people thought we wanted to punish Philip Morris. It wasn't to punish, it was to make them stand up and take notice and be responsible.
Richard Boken had his first cigarette at 13 and for more than 40 years smoked at least 2 packets of Marlboro cigarettes a day. In 1999 he was diagnosed with lung cancer, which has now spread to his back and brain. In court his lawyers argued he'd become the victim of the industry's campaign to promote smoking as cool while concealing its dangerous health risks.
He cares that he's taken a shot at Philip Morris and it's landed. And I congratulate him for using some of his energy, and he doesn't have much left to do this.
In their defence, the tobacco giants argued that despite the fact that Mr. Boken started smoking before health warnings were issued on cigarette packets, when he did know of the risks, he still chose to continue smoking.
I don't think it's believable to suggest that somebody who smoked cigarettes in this country, especially in California over the last 30 years, wasn't warned about the risks of smoking or wasn't aware of the risks of smoking.
Philip Morris says it will appeal against the decision, but lawyers predict such massive payouts will inevitably open the way for more claims against the tobacco industry in the US. Campaigners here say those damaged by smoking will be encouraged to use some of the arguments in this case to convince British and European courts that they too have a right to compensation against an industry that's destroyed their health and profited from their addiction. Navdeep Dhariwal, BBC News.
Martin Day is a lawyer who's acted on behalf of smokers. He's with me now. Thank you very much for coming in. What are the implications of this American court decision? Do you think we could ever see such huge payouts here?
Sadly, rather, I think highly unlikely. We've got 2 big hurdles that we have to overcome here as against the states. The first is that we face a judge rather than a jury, and traditionally that has been shown that the judges are far more conservative than the juries. But secondly, our cost regime here means that anybody taking on the industry face the prospect of having to pay the tobacco industry's bill if the case is lost, which could be many millions of pounds, and that traditionally has really put most people off.
Yeah, that's a real disincentive, isn't it? Do you think the money is ever going to be paid to this man?
I think very sadly that, as far as I understand it, he's almost certain to die in the very near future. In terms of the time that we see these appeals take place in the United States, I think sadly he'll probably never see a penny.
Is it surprising that people still have a case against tobacco companies when in fact we've known that smoking causes cancer for such a long time?
I think the point here is that really it's a shared responsibility. The individual has to take some share of the blame, but equally the industry has many things that they could have done over the 50 years, and I think the last 50 years that they could have done. But I think the really sad thing is that in this country the industry have been found not to blame at all, whereas in the States they seem to be entirely to blame.
Do you think we'll follow on, very briefly?
I think it's very unlikely. I think it's possible, and it may be that we'll see some actions, but I think in the end balances against it.
Martin Day, thank you very much. Concorde is closer to taking to the air again. Designers have unveiled a new tyre which they think will prevent accidents like the one which caused the crash in France last year, in which 113 people died. That's thought to have happened when a tyre burst, puncturing a fuel tank.
This is the new tyre which will almost certainly be on Concorde when it flies again. It's a new design which is much harder to puncture, and the manufacturers claim it satisfies those responsible for rebuilding the new, safer Concorde.
This tyre, given the specifications, extremely rigorous, that were given to us by ADS to help alleviate the tyre problem in order to put back Concorde into service. We passed all those tests.
The crash last July started when a tyre was punctured by a piece of metal on the runway. The new tyre has gone through tests which mimic those conditions. As it hits takeoff speed of 240 miles per hour, a metal blade is pushed in its path. It doesn't burst, and the damaged tyre endured a series of further simulated takeoffs and landings. It's also been tested on real flights. The company responsible for getting Concorde airborne again are happy with the results.
When we look at the specification that we have developed for the tire, we had a very positive reply to all the parts of the specification.
All the tests on Concorde should be completed later this summer, and then they'll submit those improvements to see if they can regain their airworthiness certificate. If everything goes according to plan, Concorde should be carrying passengers again by this autumn. Tom Heap, BBC News, Paris.
Lord Archer's private life became the centre of his perjury trial at the Old Bailey today. His former secretary claimed she was frequently asked to buy gifts for the millionaire novelist's mistresses. Lord Archer denies charges of perjury and perverting the course of justice. Duncan Kennedy is at the Old Bailey. Duncan, these revelations about Lord Archer's private life, how far did they go?
An extraordinary morning. It came in context of Mrs. Pepiat, Angela Pepiat, who was former secretary of Jeffrey Archer. The prosecution say that Jeffrey Archer asked her to fill in the diary that was used in Jeffrey Archer's 1987 libel case. That's the context of this. What the defence have been doing this morning is trying to cast doubt on her credibility, accusing her effectively of fiddling her expenses. And it was during this exchange that these extraordinary revelations came up. And if I can just go through one or two of them. She was asked to go through her accounts. And at one point, Mrs. Pepiat said, "I don't think Jeffrey would be particularly happy about this," bearing in mind Jeffrey Archer's listening to this. And she said, "I bought things on his behalf, possibly a Gucci item." And she went on, "I was asked to buy Andy a gift." Andy was Jeffrey Archer's mistress at the time. And Mr. Purnell, the defence barrister, asked her, "That's Andrina Colquhoun?" And Mrs. Pepiat replied, "Yes, that's right." Mrs. Colquhoun being Mrs. Pepiat's predecessor as the secretary for Jeffrey Archer.
And at one point, Mrs. Pepiat said that she was ashamed. What was she talking about?
What happened there was that she was giving evidence to the court, and her children are in court, and she turned around at one point and said, "My children don't know this, but I did certain things I'm ashamed of. They don't know about these things." And she went on, "There are items I did buy for myself, but insisted that Lord Archer knew what was going on." And she went on, she had to use her credit card because Jeffrey was meant to be whiter than white. He was deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. He had his mistress and still had other girlfriends who came round to his flat, and I had to use my credit card for that. So all sorts of revelations coming out this morning. Mrs. Pepiat later outside the courtroom broke down in tears, but she will continue giving her evidence this afternoon.
Duncan, thank you. 5 members of the Northern Ireland football squad are in police custody in the Czech Republic after an alleged incident in a Prague nightclub. It followed the team's 3-1 defeat in last night's World Cup qualifier. One of those arrested is the team's captain, Michael Hughes. Meanwhile, the FA is calling for action after the England captain, David Beckham, was pelted with missiles during the team's 2-0 win over Greece in Athens. Football World's governing body, FIFA, said it will investigate what happened, but along with the arrest of 80 England fans, it's an incident which spoiled a successful night for the England team.
A relaxed and very satisfied David Beckham arriving back home early this morning to be greeted by the usual cluster of adoring fans. There was plenty to smile about. The England captain had played a major role in increasing his side's chances of reaching next year's World Cup finals. He and his teammates can now start their summer holidays, able to reflect on a job well done. It had been a richly deserved victory. Both the goals came in the second half, and once again, Paul Scholes got his name on the score sheet for his country. The second was simply a David Beckham special.
Oh, and that's the second goal and the one that clinches 3 World Cup points for England.
The captain had rounded off another memorable performance for his country in style.
It's a great team performance tonight. You know, we've been patient, we've played our way through. The back four are absolutely excellent. The midfield passed it around so well, and the forwards just moved so we can hit them all the time. You know, it's just a great team performance.
So far, there's been no stopping Sven-Göran Eriksson. He's become the only England manager to win his first 5 games in charge. The one sour note of the evening was a treatment of Beckham by some of the home fans. A number of missiles were thrown at him, leading the FA to complain to the Greek authorities. Eriksson, though, will prefer to dwell on the main challenge ahead, beating Germany 2-0 winners over Albania last night when they meet in September. James Pearce, BBC News.
And the time's nearly 16 minutes past 1, and later in the programme, as Timothy McVeigh faces execution on Monday, we ask what forces shaped the Oklahoma bomber. And the wildlife that's flourishing because foot and mouth has kept us out of the countryside. The Oklahoma bomber Timothy McVeigh will be executed on Monday. His lawyers had been trying to get the death sentence stopped, arguing that the FBI had withheld evidence from the original trial. But a judge in Denver said even that couldn't alter the fact that McVeigh had carried out the bombing. So what made McVeigh bomb the FBI's headquarters in Oklahoma? Our correspondent, Robin Aitken, has been there to find out.
McVeigh, Scott, how you know Scott? You remember Sally? Sally?
The bombing at Oklahoma City was McVeigh's revenge for what happened at Waco. Now the US government is going to put him to death. On April the 19th, 1993, federal agents moved in force against the members of an obscure sect, the Branch Davidians, on their compound. About 80 people, 20 of them children, died. The tragic events here at Waco had consequences. They gave a sharp focus to those already distrustful of the US government, among them Timothy McVeigh, who later gave what happened here as his justification for the bombing of Oklahoma City. The truck bomb planted by McVeigh was devastating, but the clean-cut young man presented to Americans as chief suspect a few days later was a frightening enigma. Who was this homegrown terrorist? He was born in 1968 and raised in Pendleton, upstate New York, an ordinary sort of place, and McVeigh's life and family seemed ordinary too. A psychiatrist was appointed by the court to assess McVeigh before his trial. He says he developed a childhood hatred of bullies.
He's a young man who's been depressed much of his life, and it's that depression that probably, without him fully understanding it, motivated a good deal of his action. He's a young man that is capable of feeling great anger, particularly at people or institutions that he considers to be bullies.
When he was 20, McVeigh joined the army. He was a star recruit, an excellent shot and diligent soldier. He was soon promoted sergeant. He served in the Gulf War and was decorated, then tried to get into the Green Berets, but failed, subsequently drifting onto the gun show circuit. The Turner Diaries, a racist fantasy novel whose hero destroys the FBI building in Washington with a massive truck bomb, was another fateful influence. The book teaches leaderless resistance, how one man can strike hard by acting alone. The FBI fears the concept.
That lone terrorist is going to be able to beat you on a number of occasions because if no one else knows, then it can succeed.
This cycle of violence has already claimed 250 lives. Robin Aitken, BBC News, Oklahoma.
And let's speak to our Washington correspondent, Johnny Diamond. Johnny, is Timothy McVeigh now certain to die?
He is pretty certain to die, as certain as anything can be in this really quite astonishing saga. There will be a further appeal, almost certainly made by McVeigh's lawyers today, but it's the way in which the judge yesterday rejected their original appeal that leads one to think there's not much chance. His lawyers made two cases. One was that the withholding of nearly 4,500 documents by the FBI from the defense team had effectively defrauded the court, had not played by the rules. And the other was that within those documents, which they've had almost a month to examine, there was material which cast doubt on the original case, which suggested there might be a wider conspiracy. But the judge, who had been pretty critical of the FBI, dismissed both of those. He said that there was no intention to defraud the court, and also that there was nothing within the documents that didn't prove McVeigh to be, as he said, an instrument of death and destruction.
Now, the district court made this decision, district court judge. Could it be overturned in the circuit court or even in the Supreme Court?
Yes, there are two more appeals that could be made, and we think that those are going to happen really pretty quickly. The problem is for McVeigh that he may not wish these appeals to go forward. He has made it clear that he doesn't wish to plead for his life. His lawyers are seeing him later today.
Johnny, thank you very much for that. Foot and mouth may have been bad news for many people in the countryside, but it's brought unexpected benefits for wildlife. Now that footpaths are being reopened, animals, birds and rare flowers are being spotted in areas that they haven't been seen in years. Jane O'Brien is at the Wildflower and Wetlands Trust at Slimbridge in Gloucestershire. Jane.
Well, Anna, this is one of the few places where you can still see birds safely in their natural environment. But a lot of the monitoring work here has had to come to a halt because of the foot and mouth restrictions, which means although we think birds are coming back to their natural habitats elsewhere, we can't be certain. But there is anecdotal evidence that they are starting to return to the countryside. Selsey Common in Gloucestershire hasn't been seen like this in living memory. Acres of grazing land have been transformed into a carpet of flowers. Because there are no sheep, rare species like orchids now flourish. Across Britain there are similar stories. These are the first pictures in 40 years to show choughs, the native bird of Cornwall that had stopped breeding in the region. It's thought the closure of coastal footpaths may have helped to encourage their return. Choughs bred in captivity won't now be released to give the wild birds a chance to establish themselves. Left alone and protected from people and farm animals, nature is reclaiming the countryside.
We've always recognised that humans have an impact on wildlife, and perhaps that impact has been greater than we actually realised. And it could be that there may be some sites which we would hope to keep public out of for certain periods of the year, for example the breeding season.
Dartmoor in Devon remains closed to the public, and although foot and mouth restrictions mean no scientific research can be carried out, there have been sightings of lapwings and curlews. Skylarks, which nest on the ground, have been seen on the Isle of Wight, and there have been many sightings on newly opened footpaths of Britain's only poisonous snake, the adder. But although places like Selsey Common look beautiful now, without proper management, they would quickly revert to scrubland. Well, of course, Anna, these changes have only been noticed over the last few months, and it's impossible to say what the long-term effects of these foot and mouth restrictions are. However, I am joined by Tony Richardson, who's the director of the Slimbridge Trust here. Mr. Richardson, what have you actually noticed?
Well, here at Slimbridge we are a wild bird reserve where birds are kept away quite deliberately from the people who look at them through hides and observation periods. We have kingfishers, for example, breeding here, which have done really rather well this year. They've been breeding here before, but I suspect, you know, that where river systems have and ponds have paths running close, they're doing better this year than they have in the past, and they seem much calmer. Certainly locally, I've first-hand evidence of woodlands where paths normally run through, giving deer much more confidence. Deer are coming out and grazing during the day, but safe in the knowledge they can jump back to a tree.
So very briefly then, is there an argument for keeping people away from these areas?
Well, the recently passed Wildlife and Countryside Act actually is strengthening wildlife-rich areas in such a way that they are able to be looked after. But it certainly has to be borne in mind for the future.
Tony Richardson, thank you very much indeed. And you can come here to see birds in their natural habitat. Anna.
Jane, thank you very much. And more now on the general election. And when the results come in, for many, it will be a moment of sheer triumph. But spare a thought for those MPs whose political careers are about to come to a halt. What happens to them after the votes are counted, their rosettes are in the bin and their seat in the Commons now belongs to someone else? Rory Kethlen-Jones has been finding out.
Imagine this is your office, and tonight you're going to find out whether your job here is safe when your employers tell you in a very public way whether you've been sacked. 4 years ago, that's what happened to Liz Lynn. She found herself comforting her Liberal Democrat supporters after the voters rejected her. And then there was her own pain to deal with.
For months afterwards, I went through some sort of mourning process. Different things of anger, of just sorrow, everything you go through. And it took me a long time to get over it, because that was my life.
While Liz Lynn returned to politics as an MEP, others have chosen a fresh start. This Cuban bar in London, with its mementos of a socialist revolution, belongs to a former Conservative Treasury Minister. Philip Oppenheim, who lost his seat in 1997, now mixes a little light political punditry with a restaurant business.
Let me mint. It's a very, very different life. Business has a lot of very different pressures from politics. But I think it is always a good idea for anyone who's going to go into politics or go back into politics to run a business and have the experience of employing people.
And Una MacDonald has come a long way since her days as a Labour MP, which were ended by the voters in 1987. She's now an expert on financial regulation, advising companies and foreign governments, but still remembers how it felt to be voted out.
It is brutal, I think, in that it's a very public
expulsion from your job. You're made redundant in a way that everybody knows about, and your loss of status is obvious to everybody.
For those who don't make it back here, there is at least a pretty generous redundancy package, between 50 and 100% of the annual salary, depending on their length of service. But that may not make up for the pain of a very public sacking. Rory Catherine-Jones, BBC News, Westminster.
It must be the nightmare of every skydiver, parachutes becoming entangled, leaving the jumpers plunging towards the earth with nothing to stop them. Well, that's just what happened to two members of the Australian skydiving team. Amazingly, both walked away to tell the tale, as Sangeeta Maiskar now reports.
This is the moment every parachutist dreads. Just seconds into attempting their formation, the chutes of two members of the Australian dive team tangle. Entwined, the two begin spiralling 5,000 feet towards Earth. It's 13 seconds before the first diver is able to cut himself loose. Moments later, the other follows. Their survival depended on a split-second decision.
We discussed it with one another. Not an in-depth conversation by all means, but it was just a case of you clear and cut away.
Managing to activate their reserve chutes in time, both men miraculously survived, with one diver, Archie Jameson, suffering just small rope burns. 8 years ago, Jameson was involved in a similar accident during the same stunt, but again managed to cut himself free. This latest incident hasn't dented either diver's confidence. They've already begun training for the World Championships in Spain later this month. Sangeeta Maiskar, BBC News.
And at 27 minutes past 1, the main news again. The polls have opened and the voting's begun. The polling stations will be open until 10 o'clock. The first results should be known an hour later. And just a reminder that David Dimbleby will be here on BBC One with all the results as they come in, plus reaction and analysis. That's Vote 2001, The Verdict, tonight from 5 to 10. But that's all this Thursday lunchtime from the 1 o'clock news. Good afternoon.